Good afternoon. I'm Matteo Guaita. I will be presenting the progresses on my thesis called Kinetic Modeling of Plasma Thruster Plumes, advised by Mario Merino and Eduardo Edo. So the first thing we need to answer when we're talking about the kinetic modeling of plasma thruster plumes is what is a plasma thruster plume? On the sketch of the left, you have a summary of all the beautiful things that happen in a plasma thruster plume. And the main thing to know is that such a plume is what is emitted, is the ensemble of particles emitted by a plasma thruster, and is typically composed of positive ions, negative electrons, and neutral particles. Here I subdivided it into a near plume and far plume, where different plasma characteristics and different processes take place, but that for the moment is not particularly important. The other question is, what is a kinetic model? Well, I think the, let's say, easiest way to define it is opposing it to the better known fluid models. So in fluid models, we typically ignore the single particles composing a fluid and rather prefer to assume their distribution functions in order to obtain some transport equations which we then solve. On the other hand, in kinetic modeling, such as particle inside codes, what we do is consider some macroparticles representing the real particles, the physical particles present in a plume, and integrate their equations of motion, so move them around a domain. We can then weigh the densities of these particles to the nodes of the cells in which we discretize the domain, and use these densities to solve the Poisson equation, retrieve some electric fields, and begin the loop again. So moving the particles, obtaining the fields, and so on until we reach a steady state. The objectives of modeling plasma thruster plumes are multiple. One of the main ones is to understand, define, predict, and possibly employ in a proper way the interaction between the plume and the spacecraft that is hosting the thruster. In fact, the interaction of the energetic charged particles with the thruster surfaces may lead to erosion, electric charging, electric discharges, and so on, which need to be understood and, in the three cases mentioned before, avoided as much as possible. Another point of interest in the cases specifically of magnetized plumes is that the plume is part of the thrust production mechanism. So we are interested in modeling it because in order to optimize the performance of the thruster itself. There are then another series of points of interest, such as controlling the direction of the thrust, which can be done with magnetic fields in the plume, the interpretation of the experimental data, which is typically measured in the plumes of thrusters, because taking measurements in the sources is particularly complex, and then the idea that plasma plumes may also be employed for debris removal in space, and many other concepts. In particular, my thesis concentrates on a series of open research points. The major one is the effects that the experimental conditions that we have in on-ground facilities have on the plume and on the behavior of the thruster, with respect of what really happens in space, which is our, let's say, condition of use of the thruster. In particular, in on-ground facilities, we have higher background densities and the presence of facility walls, which truncate the expansion of the plume. Nested within this topic is also the question of the behavior of electrons. Electrons have a very complex response inside of the plume. They are often shown to present a kinetic form of cooling, so the temperature decreases, but this is hard to capture through fluid models while kinetic models do observe it. And therefore, the physics behind the motion and behavior of electrons is fundamental to understand then the general properties of the plume. There are then another series of questions which my thesis is not fully involved in, but which it borders somehow. There is the plasma detachment from the magnetic fields in the plume in the case of magnetic nozzles, and the effects of collisional processes that take place in the plume and the way that they alter their properties and the way that the increased number of collisions that take place in facilities, in experimental facilities, alter the plume with respect to what happens in space. So last year, you probably don't remember, but in the doctoral meetings of last year, I presented a whole amount of work which we were going to submit for publication. And I have good news. We have managed to publish 2 papers. This slide summarizes the first one on the magnetic arch. The magnetic arch is a novel magnetic topology proposed in the case of 2 electrodress plasma thrusters. So here in the domain sketch on the top left, you have half of the domain because the domain is symmetric, and so the red surface is the injection surface representing one thruster. The other thruster is on the other side of the symmetry plane, and we have that in the case of the magnetic arch. The magnetic lines loop in an arch between the 2 thrusters. Now, this magnetic topology represents or has some advantages with respect to the more traditional, let's say, straighter magnetic nozzles in which the magnetic lines do not loop between the sources. And therefore, we are interested in modeling it. In particular, our study concentrated on the behavior at the symmetry plane of the plasma, where the plasma beams emitted by the 2 thrusters crossed, and also on the influence of the level of magnetization of electrons on the electron currents. You have on the right topmost plot is the out-of-plane electron currents, which are strictly linked to the magnetic thrust obtained, while on the bottom you have the in-plane electron currents. Finally, there was also a section in the paper regarding the effects of the experimental conditions on the plume with respect to what happens in space. The second paper was about the plume of a graded ion thruster, which is a more let's say, mature technology. Here you have a fancy video of the transient of the simulation. It's not too important what the video represents, it's just for aesthetic purposes. One of the main takeaways of this work, amongst other things, was the possibility of classifying inside of a graded ion thruster plume the electrons into 2 categories. The first are trapped electrons, which are those electrons trapped inside of the potential well of the plume. And these electrons guarantee the neutralization of the space charge of the plume, and therefore the formation of a potential map with moderate potential values. However, very importantly, these electrons require inelastic collisions to form. The counterpart to these electrons are the free electrons. These electrons are free to escape to infinity. They guarantee the neutralization of the current of the thruster, so the fact that the thruster emits a 0 net current. And in principle, at the beginning, and in absence of inelastic collisions, all electrons are free electrons. They, however, do not guarantee the charge neutralization of the plume. As I said, this was published as well. So what we have been doing during the last year has been mostly concentrated on validating the results of the paper that I just mentioned, so the study on the graded ion thruster. This has been done in collaboration with the Justus Liebig University in Gießen through the comparison of experimental data with our simulations. we have experimental data and simulations of something of like 8 or 9 operating points of the thruster, and we can compare the two. So here in these plots, I am showing in red for all the next plots. In red, you have the experimental data. In blue, you have the simulation results. And in this case, I'm showing the density at axial sections in the radial direction at axial sections through the plume. So you see that in this case, the simulation results fall well within the error bars. So we're very happy. We can do the same with the electron temperature. And here again, the matching is quite good, although at smaller axial distances, we get some lower temperatures in the simulations. But temperature is a very complicated parameter of the plasma, so we're already very happy with these results. We can also move to the ion currents, and here the matching is not as good, and in principle the ion currents should be easy enough parameters of the plasma both to simulate and to measure, so we were a bit surprised by this result. However, we have strong reasons to believe that this is a problem in the probe itself that is measuring these currents. If we then move to the ion energies, here you have the ion energy distribution function at different locations along the axis of the plume. We see that the simulations and the experiments match very well. Here, I believe the maximum error was below 2 or 3%. And finally, we have the ion energy distribution function, which is backflowing to the thruster itself or to the spacecraft hosting it. And here you see that it may appear like the matching between experiments and simulations is not that good, but we're actually quite happy with this. Here, the shape of the energy distribution function is more or less predicted by the simulations. And we also know, I'm not showing this here because I would need much more time, but we also see that the simulations predict the trends of this EVDF. So if we increase the background pressure, we see that the energy decreases, both in simulations and experiments. If we change the thruster potential, the simulations predicts correctly the way in which the VDF moves. So qualitatively, we have a very good prediction. Quantitatively, we can still improve, although this, a bit like the temperature, is a very complex parameter of the thruster, so we are quite happy with these results. All of this validation work will be presented at the next IEPC. And finally, I am currently on research day, as you know, at the Justus Liebig University in Gießen, Germany. And the idea is to continue with the collaboration between simulations and experiments, but in this case, I am concentrating on the retarding potential analyzer probe, which is the probe that was giving us those ion energy distribution functions which we were looking at before. So what they have set up here in Gießen is an experimental campaign which they hope to use to validate the probe. So they emit a well-known ion energy distribution, measure it with the RPA, and see what the differences between the ideal signal and the obtained signal are. I am doing the same thing numerically. So I have set up a model of the probe, which you see here on the left. Again, the plots are not that important to understand. It's not that important to understand what they are representing. This is just to say that I have a numerical model of the probe and that I am running essentially the same experiments, but numerically. This allows us to understand what's going on inside of the probe. And since what I'm seeing right now is that I am obtaining more or less the same measurements in my numerical version, this will then in the future allow me to extend our research into, let's say, into properties of the plasma which the experiment cannot reach because of its setup, but I can instead reach in the simulations. The final idea would be to find a convolution function which allows me to pass from the measured values back to the ideal value, therefore removing any most deviations from, or most measurement errors from the probe measurements. And finally, this is a list of my scientific contributions. You have the 2 journal papers, which I mentioned before, and a list of conference papers and project contributions. So that is everything. I hope everybody in Madrid is doing fine, and I look forward to seeing you again.